It arrived in a plain brown envelope, sometimes, or in a larger flat mailer, depending on the year, but always with the same effect. You picked it up from the mailbox and you felt the weight of it before you saw what it was. And the weight was the first part of the experience. Substantial, purposeful, the weight of something that had been assembled with the intention of being consulted rather than glanced at. The Tower Hobbies catalog. You carried it inside and you set it on the kitchen table and you opened it. And what came out was the smell of fresh ink on glossy paper. A smell that belonged to a specific category of anticipation that the digital world has not replaced and does not know how to replace. The pages were dense with product, not the designed by algorithm density of a modern e-commerce page, where everything is identical in size and the sorting is done by a machine that knows your browsing history. But the deliberate density of a catalog whose creators understood that the person holding it had sent away for it specifically to be informed of what was possible and what it would cost. Engines, radios, servos, kits for aircraft and boats and ground vehicles, covering films in every color available, glues and tools and fuel and propellers and wheels and landing gear and clevises and servo horns and every small mechanical component that the radio-controlled aircraft world required. 406 pages by 1980. The full catalog of a hobby universe, arranged by category, illustrated with photographs that made each item look exactly as real and desirable as it was. You circled things. This is the part that people who lived this era remember with a particular warmth. The act of circling items in the catalog with a pen or a pencil, marking the things you wanted, sometimes writing a price total in the margin as you went, sometimes circling things you knew you couldn't yet afford as a way of establishing intent, a declaration to yourself that these things existed and that you were aware of them and that they were eventually going to be yours. The catalog was a planning document. It was a record of aspiration. If the memory of those pages is still somewhere in you, if the smell of that catalog or the weight of it in your hands is findable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but so stories like this one don't fade the way the catalog itself has faded. The culture that produced it deserves to be remembered, and keeping these histories visible is how they stay visible. Bruce Holsek was an engineering student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 1971. He was also an avid radio control hobbyist, which in 1971 put him at the early edge of a culture that was developing faster than most people could track. Radio control technology, the ability to send control signals from a handheld transmitter to a receiver in a model aircraft or boat, operating the model's control surfaces and throttle from a distance, had been available to civilian hobbyists since the late 1950s, but it had been expensive and technically demanding in ways that limited the community to enthusiasts who were both serious and relatively affluent. Through the 1960s, the equipment improved and the prices began to fall. And by the early 1970s, something was happening in the radio control hobby that looked very much like the beginning of a mass market. Holsek saw it. He was living in Illini Tower, the student housing complex, and he had $800 in savings and the kind of clarity about what he wanted to do that some people find early and most people spend years looking for. He wanted to be in the radio control hobby business. He chose the name Tower Hobbies because of where he was living. When the idea solidified, he bought a small inventory of RC products and began advertising sales by mail. His brother Mark, who was still in high school, handled shipping from the basement of the family home. This is the kind of origin story that is easy to describe and easy to underestimate. A $800 investment, a student apartment, a basement operation run by a younger sibling. It sounds modest because it was modest, and its eventual scale makes the modesty feel almost fictional in retrospect. It is important to hold both things at once, the smallness of the beginning and the size of what grew from it, because what grew from it was not the result of capital or luck alone. It was the result of a man who understood something specific about what the radio control hobby needed from a supplier and who organized his business around providing that thing. What the hobby needed in 1971 and for the decade that followed was access, not physical access. There were hobby shops in most American cities and many smaller towns, and most of them carried some inventory of RC products. What the hobby lacked was comprehensive access. The ability for a hobbyist in a small town in rural Illinois or rural anywhere to obtain the full range of products that the hobby required at a price that reflected genuine value rather than the premium that local monopoly allows. If your town had one hobby shop, you paid what the hobby shop charged and bought what the hobby shop stocked and waited for them to order what they didn't stock. If you were in a town without a hobby shop, you drove to the nearest city and paid what that shop charged. The mail order model solved this problem by making location irrelevant. What mattered was having a catalog and a mailing address and a method of payment and the willingness to wait. By 1975, Tower Hobbies sales had passed $1 million. By 1978, they had reached $4 million, making Tower Hobbies the largest mail-order radio control product retailer in the hobby industry. By fall 1982, sales were above $15 million annually, and Tower Hobbies was the world's biggest mail-order retailer of radio-controlled airplane and boat models. These numbers did not arrive by accident. They arrived because Holitzek and his team built an operation that could deliver what it promised. The right product at the right price, accurately described in the catalog, reliably shipped to wherever the order came from, with customer service that treated the person on the other end of the transaction as someone whose continued satisfaction was the foundation of the business. The catalog was the face of this operation, and the catalog deserves its own examination. By 1980, it ran to 406 pages, not 406 pages of padding or repetition, but 406 pages of inventory. The full range of what the radio control hobby required, from the largest, most expensive radio systems and aircraft kits to the smallest, most affordable consumable components, organized and presented in a format that a serious hobbyist could spend hours with and still find something new to notice. The people who received that catalog were not passive browsers. They were researchers. They were comparing specifications and prices, reading the brief descriptions that accompanied each item, looking at the photographs that showed the products in context, building in their minds the configuration they were planning to purchase or the upgrade they were saving toward. The catalog was the information infrastructure of the hobby for an era in which information was not instantly available, when knowing what something cost or whether it existed required either a trip to a shop or a catalog in your mailbox. Tower's catalog was the most comprehensive source of that information available to most American RC hobbyists. The act of calling in an order deserves its own account. Tower Hobbies was among the first companies in the hobby industry to offer a toll-free phone order line, an 800 number that a customer could call without paying for the long distance. The person who answered spoke about the products with the knowledge of someone who understood them, could answer questions about compatibility and specifications, could suggest alternatives if an item was out of stock. The transaction was personal in a way that online ordering is not. You were speaking with a human being in Champaign, Illinois, about the things you had circled in the catalog, and the human being was helping you finalize what you were actually going to order, and confirming that everything was in stock and telling you approximately when it would arrive. Then you waited. This is the part that no amount of description fully recovers for anyone who has not experienced it, because the waiting was not merely the interval between purchase and possession. It was an active state. You knew the package was coming. You knew what was in it. You knew approximately when it would arrive. And the approach of that date was a specific kind of anticipation that the next day delivery era has made almost theoretical to describe. The waiting changed your relationship to the thing you had ordered in a way that immediate possession does not. You had time to think about it. You had time to plan what you would do with it. You had time to tell your friends about it and to show them the page in the catalog where it appeared. The package would have been picked by someone in the Tower Hobbies warehouse in Champaign, a person who walked the aisles of shelved inventory and pulled the items on the pick list one by one, who verified the part numbers and checked the quantities and packed the order in the specific sequence that kept delicate components from being damaged by heavier ones. This was not an automated process in the early years. It was done with the kind of variability and occasional imperfection that people introduce, but also with the specific care that people can exercise when they understand what they're doing and why it matters. The tower order pickers were in many cases hobbyists. They knew what the glow plug or the prop shaft or the servo extension was for, and they handled it accordingly. When the package arrived, a brown box from Champaign, Illinois, with the Tower Hobbies name on the return address, the opening of it was an event, not the casual slitting open of a delivery that has arrived on the schedule you designed around it, but the specific celebration of something that had been anticipated and had now, after the days of waiting, arrived. The components would be examined. The instruction manual, if one was included, would be read before anything else happened. The parts would be laid out and organized and understood. The purchase was complete, but the relationship with the purchase had only begun. The radio control hobby that Tower Hobbies served through the 1970s and into the 1980s was itself in the process of transforming from a specialized pursuit into something much broader. The engines that powered RC aircraft in the late 1960s had been expensive, temperamental, and demanding machines that rewarded mechanical knowledge and punished casual engagement. The radio systems of the same era were heavy, complex, and failure-prone, enough that the trust required to put them in a flying aircraft was earned through experience rather than assumption. The combined effect of these factors was a hobby that filtered its participants aggressively. It admitted those with the technical aptitude and the economic resources to sustain repeated failure and the patience to learn what failure was teaching them. And it discouraged everyone else. The technology improved throughout the 1970s at a pace that the hobby community was working hard to keep up with. Servo response times improved. Radio systems became more reliable. The synthesized crystal frequency systems that replaced the older tunable units made interference and frequency conflicts less common. The engine designs matured. The kit designs improved to the point where a person of modest mechanical ability could build a flying aircraft that would actually fly, rather than simply attempt to fly and fail. Each improvement lowered the barrier to entry a fraction, and the cumulative effect of many small improvements over several years was a hobby that was, by the early 1980s, genuinely accessible to a much broader population than it had served a decade before. Tower Hobbies served this expanding population with the specific recognition that the expanding population needed something different from what the original community had needed. The serious expert hobbyist of 1968 knew what he wanted before he opened a catalog. The intermediate hobbyist of 1978 knew generally what he wanted, but needed help with the specifics of which version and which brand, and whether it was compatible with what he already owned. The beginning hobbyist of 1983, drawn in by the availability of better and cheaper products and the growing visibility of RC aviation as a public activity, needed to be guided through the entire decision process, from what kind of aircraft to what radio system, to what engine, to what tools to have on hand at the flying field. Tower's catalog was designed to serve all three of these people. The detailed product descriptions gave the expert the specifications he needed. The product recommendations. Tower Hobbies introduced the concept of specifically flagging their top recommended products. The items whose combination of quality, price, and performance made them the best choice for most buyers gave the intermediate buyer a reliable signal to follow. The organization of the catalog and the accessibility of the phone order line gave the beginner a pathway into the hobby that didn't require prior expertise to navigate. In Champaign, the physical operation grew to match the scale that these ambitions required. The warehouse filled with the inventory that the catalog described, not a selection of the catalog's contents, but the whole of it, on shelves organized for the fulfillment of the thousands of orders that arrived each week by mail and by phone. The people who worked in the warehouse and in the customer service department were, in many cases, hobbyists themselves. People who chose to work for Tower Hobbies because the job kept them close to the hobby they loved and gave them early access to the products that the catalog had not yet announced. The customer service culture that Holwaytech established was not a policy document. It was a disposition, organized around the recognition that the hobbyist who called with a problem was not an obstacle, but an opportunity to solve something, to demonstrate competence, to retain a customer who would return again and again if the experience warranted it. The AMA flying field was the physical world that Tower Hobbies served. The Academy of Model Aeronautics maintained a network of chartered clubs throughout the country, each with a leased or owned flying site, a frequency board, and a flight line, a culture of mentorship and mutual assistance that was the living form of the hobby's values. On any given weekend morning at an AMA field in the early 1980s, the talk before flying began was about equipment, what radio you were running, what engine was in the aircraft you'd brought, what you had just ordered from Tower. The catalog was a shared reference in these conversations. You had one, and the person next to you at the flight line had one, and you had both circled different things, and comparing what you'd ordered and when it had arrived, and whether it matched your expectations was a normal and genuinely interesting exchange. The hobby shop was the local complement to this catalog culture. A well-run hobby shop in the early 1980s stocked a meaningful inventory of RC products and staffed it with people who knew the products well enough to answer questions about them. The shop provided immediate access for items you needed today. A glow plug, a prop, a servo before a Saturday morning flying session, While the Tower catalog provided access to the full range at prices the shop often could not match for slower moving items. The two coexisted productively in most communities. The shop for immediate needs and expertise, Tower for variety and value, and the items the shop didn't carry. The convergence of these two channels, the local shop and the Tower catalog, around the AMA flying field produced a specific kind of community conversation. At a field on a Saturday morning in 1984, the equipment visible among the pilots ranged from decades-old ignition-powered models, maintained through years of careful service, to the newest ARF aircraft, from Great Planes or Kyosho that had arrived from Tower earlier in the week. The comparison was not competitive in any unfriendly sense. It was the natural expression of a community that valued equipment and understood it. Here's what you ordered. Here's what it does. Here's how it compares to what I ordered last month. Here's what the catalog says about the version they just released. The catalog was a shared text. The products it contained were the shared language. This ecosystem was held together by the common experience of the catalog. The Tower Hobbies catalog was what told a hobbyist in Decatur, Illinois, or Savannah, Georgia, or Medford, Oregon, that the full range of what radio control offered was available to them, not the selection their local shop stocked, which reflected the judgment of one person in one city about what that particular community would buy, but the full selection, the complete range of what the manufacturers of the world were producing for this hobby, assembled in one place and made accessible by mail. This was not a trivial thing. In an era without the internet, it was the difference between a hobby that felt circumscribed by geography and one that felt genuinely unlimited. A boy in a small town in Kansas who had gotten into RC flying through a secondhand transmitter and a kit he'd built over the winter had, through the Tower catalog, the same access to the Futaba radio system or the OS engine or the Great Planes kit that the hobbyist in Chicago had through his hobby shop. The playing field of equipment and knowledge was leveled by the catalog in a way that would not have been possible without it. This democratizing function of the catalog is easy to overlook because it was so thoroughly performed. The inequality it corrected became invisible because it was corrected. And what remained was a hobby community that took for granted its access to the full range of what the hobby offered. Holif 49 to life some raw against wire. Tower Hobbies had built the thing it claimed to be, and the people who received the catalog were receiving the most comprehensive access to the radio control world that existed outside of attending a major hobby industry trade show. The company that Clint Atkins purchased in 1984 had already established itself as the defining mail-order operation in American RC hobby commerce. The deal Atkins offered the Holex allowed Bruce to continue running Tower, while the capital and structure of Atkins's business organization provided the resources for continued growth. In 1985, Atkins combined Tower Hobbies with Great Planes Model Distributors, a Champaign company founded in 1972 by an engineer named Don Anderson, which had developed into one of the premier producers of RC aircraft kits in the American market, to form HobbyKo, Inc. The combined entity was, in its conception and for much of its operating life, the kind of vertically integrated hobby company that the industry had not previously seen at this scale. A manufacturer, a distributor, and a retailer under the same corporate umbrella, with the Tower catalog as its primary consumer-facing instrument. The catalog continued to grow. The 1980 issue had run to 406 pages. Later editions would carry over 60,000 products from more than 400 manufacturers, with the Tower Hobbies top choice designations providing guidance through a selection whose breadth would have been incomprehensible to the beginner without some navigational aid. Hobbico's distribution relationships, exclusive U.S. distributor for Futaba radio control products, exclusive North American distributor for OS engines, gave Tower access to the products that serious buyers most wanted, and the Tower catalog was the document through which those products were most widely made available. In 1995, Tower Hobbies launched its website, towerhobbies.com, among the earliest commercial websites in the hobby industry. This was not a reactive move made in response to competitive pressure. It was a proactive recognition that the internet was going to be a significant commercial channel and that Tower's position in the hobby was strong enough to be among the first to exploit it. The same company that had pioneered the toll-free phone order line was now building the online presence that would eventually, though not yet, transform the economics of what it sold. 2010, the catalog described itself as being in its 39th year, and the letter that introduced that edition reflected on the decades that had passed with the quiet pride of an institution that had become what its founder imagined it could become. The catalog was still being printed. The phone order line was still operational. The employee stock ownership plan that had made Tower a 100% employee-owned enterprise gave every person who worked there a direct stake in the business's continued success. The hobby the catalog served was still active. The lithium polymer battery and brushless motor technology that had transformed electric RC flight in the mid-2000s had brought new participants into the hobby, and the simulator software that Tower carried allowed beginners to develop basic flying skills without risking a real aircraft, lowering the barrier to entry further than any previous technology had managed. The changes that eventually eroded the Tower Hobbies catalog model did not arrive from a single direction. They accumulated through the 2000s and into the 2010s in ways that were individually manageable and collectively decisive. The Amazon effect was real, but not simple. Amazon had been founded in 1994 as an online bookstore and had expanded through the late 1990s and 2000s into a general retailer of almost everything. The early 2010s, Amazon's combination of competitive pricing, enormous selection, and increasingly fast shipping was changing the expectations of American consumers in ways that specialty retailers found difficult to accommodate. The consumer who in 1985 had sent away for the Tower catalog and waited 2 weeks for delivery was now a consumer who expected next day or 2-day delivery as a baseline, and who had access through Amazon to product descriptions and customer reviews that allowed purchasing decisions without the kind of expert knowledge that the catalog had once been uniquely positioned to provide. This shift did not mean that Tower's selection was worse, or that its prices were higher than they should be. It meant that the competitive advantage of being comprehensive, of having 60,000 items in stock and a catalog that described all of them, was diminished when a competitor could offer comparable or greater selection with comparable or better fulfillment speed and pricing. The specific value of the Tower Hobbies catalog which had been the most complete available guide to what the RC hobby offered, became less distinctive in an era when a search engine could provide comparable breadth of information with less friction. The offshore manufacturing pressure worked against the makers and brands that Tower had built its relationships around. Chinese manufacturers entering the hobby market through the 2000s offered products, ARF aircraft, ready-to-run vehicles, complete radio systems at price points that the American and Japanese manufacturers, whose names had been the backbone of the Tower catalog for decades, could not match without moving their own production offshore or accepting dramatically lower margins. HobbyKing, a Hong Kong-based online retailer that operated essentially as a direct-to-consumer channel for Asian manufactured RC products, offered prices that the Tower model could not compete with on commodity items. The hobbyist who was price sensitive and willing to wait for international shipping could find the equipment they needed for considerably less than the Tower catalog charged. These forces combined with the demographic challenges that the hobby was navigating. The average age of the active RC aircraft pilot was rising. The youth recruitment that the hobby had historically accomplished through the informal mentorship networks of the flying field and the hobby shop, the kid who saw someone flying and asked questions and was eventually invited to learn, was not happening at the rate required to replace the aging membership. The foam ARF aircraft and the plug-and-play radio systems that lowered the barrier to entry on one side of the ledger also, on the other side, removed the building culture that had been the hobby's primary mechanism for creating engaged, long-term participants. The person who bought an ARF and flew it, and eventually stopped flying it, had not acquired the deep technical investment in the hobby that the kit builder of an earlier era had acquired through the months of construction and the accumulated knowledge of engines and control systems and aerodynamics that the building process delivered. Hobbico filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on January 10th, 2018. The filing disclosed assets between $10 million and $500 million, a ratio that no restructuring was likely to improve to solvency. Horizon Hobby acquired the Tower Hobbies brand and most of Hobbico's RC assets for $18 million in April of that year. By June, the Chapter 11 filing had been converted to Chapter 7 liquidation. The specific business entity that Bruce Holsek had founded in a University of Illinois student apartment in 1971 with $800 and a mailing address was formally ended. The Tower Hobbies name continued under Horizon Hobby as a website carrying Horizon's expanding portfolio of RC brands. The address remained in Champaign. The product selection remained extensive. The thing that had made Tower Hobbies what it was, the paper catalog, the phone order line, the specific culture of a company that had been built on the belief that serving a hobbyist well was both a commercial strategy and a form of respect for the hobby they shared. Those things were not what Horizon acquired, because they were not things that could be acquired. They were the accumulated product of years of specific decisions made by specific people who understood the community they were serving from the inside, as participants rather than as investors. There is a question underneath all of this that the story of Tower Hobbies poses but does not fully answer, because the question is not really about one company or one industry. It is a question about what we gained and what we traded away when we moved from the catalog to the algorithm, from anticipation to immediacy, from the act of sending for something to the act of clicking for something. The catalog economy asks something of its participants that the algorithmic economy does not ask. It asks them to know in advance what they wanted. It asks them to engage with the information in front of them to read descriptions, to compare specifications, to consider compatibility, to plan. It asks them to wait. These are not passive requirements. They are the requirements of a relationship with commerce that produces a different kind of consumer than the one produced by one-click purchasing and next-day delivery. The wait was the productive part. This is the thing that seems most alien about the catalog era to anyone who has grown up in the Amazon era. The wait was not an inconvenience to be minimized. It was a normal and expected element of the transaction, and it produced an outcome that immediate delivery does not produce: the deep familiarity with the thing before it arrived. The person who had circled an item in the Tower catalog, called it in, and waited 2 weeks for its arrival had spent those 2 weeks in relationship with the item in a way that the person who ordered it on Monday and received it on Tuesday has not. They had thought about it. They had planned for it. They had told other people about it. The arrival of the package was the culmination of a process rather than the beginning of one. What we lose when that process disappears is not easy to name and not easy to recover once it's gone. It is something in the quality of the relationship between a person and the things they own, the difference between things you chose deliberately, through a process of research and anticipation, and things you obtained because the algorithm presented them at a moment of easy impulse. It is something in the pace of the engagement with a hobby. The difference between the hobby that organized itself around the rhythm of the catalog and the flying season and the club meeting and the slow accumulation of equipment chosen carefully, and the hobby that can be entered and equipped and abandoned in a month because the barriers to entry have been reduced to a credit card and a delivery window. None of this is an argument that the catalog era was superior in all respects to the present. It wasn't. The geographic constraints it imposed were real constraints. The hobbyist in a rural community who had to wait for the catalog and then wait again for the order to arrive was genuinely disadvantaged compared to the hobbyist in a city who could browse a well-stocked shop. The information limitations of the catalog, the brief descriptions, the photographs that sometimes did not tell you what you needed to know, the inability to compare products across multiple catalogs without having multiple catalogs were real limitations. The digital world solved real problems. Something was lost along with the problems that were solved. The anticipation is gone. The circling is gone. The weight of a Tower Hobbies catalog in your hands, the glossy pages and the dense columns of product and the specific smell of the ink is gone. The specific pleasure of calling Champaign, Illinois, and speaking to someone who knew the product and could answer your question, that is gone. The waiting by the mailbox, the brown box with the return address you recognized, the opening of the package as a celebration, those are gone in the way that specific technologies go when the conditions that required them cease to exist. If you remember those things, if you sent away for that catalog, if you circled things in it, if you built something with what arrived in that brown box from Champaign, Illinois, leave your memory in the comments. Not because the nostalgia is the point, but because the record of what that experience was like and what it meant and what it gave to the people who had it is worth keeping. The algorithm will not keep it. The institutions will not keep it. It is kept by the people who remember it, and only as long as they choose to say so. Return to the catalog. It is on the kitchen table, weighted at the corners, open to the page you had been reading before you set it down. The pages are dense with product and price. Some of the items have been circled. The total you were running in the margin is not quite right. You added an item and didn't adjust the sum. but you know what you're going to order. You know what you want first. If something is out of stock and there has to be a substitution, you have the Tower Hobbies phone number memorized because it was in the catalog every year, and you've called it more times than you could count. You will call tomorrow because the rate is lower before 8 a.m., and the person who answers will know what you're talking about when you give the part numbers. And they will tell you that everything is in stock, which you had a good feeling about because Tower usually was. The package will take about a week. It will come in a brown box with the return address in Champaign. You will open it at the kitchen table or possibly at the workbench, depending on where you are when it arrives. The catalog is still there when you walk away. It will be there will it the it, it be it be it fit because the the that is the thing we sent for, and the thing that was sent to us, and the thing that the brown box from Champaign contained, that had nothing to do with part numbers or invoice totals. It contained the next part of a long conversation. Bruce Holsek started that conversation in 1971 with $800 and a mailing address. Tower Hobbies conducted it for nearly 50 years. Some of us are still listening. Share